Good morning, and thank you for joining us on this SAG-AFTRA live stream on YouTube. To stay informed about all of our live stream and video events, we invite you to subscribe to this channel. You can go ahead and do that right now. Today, we present the President's Task Force on Education, Outreach, and Engagement live stream, Return to Work Update, New Protocols in Place. We'll be pausing throughout as we have with us Nicole Pancino and Kimberly Forbes, who are here today to translate the program into American Sign Language. Nicole and Kimberly will be trading off periodically throughout today's discussion. The presentation will begin momentarily. If you have questions that you'd like to direct to today's guests, please email pteoe@sagaftra.org. That's pteoe@sagaftra.org. As a reminder, today's program is being recorded and you can watch the replay right here on SAG-AFTRA's YouTube channel, along with a lot more great content. Now, please give a warm welcome to today's host, SAG-AFTRA Executive Vice President, Rebecca Damon.
Hi there. Thank you, Pam. Thank you very much. So hello, everybody, and welcome. It's so good to have you joining us today for what is a very important presentation on our newly revised COVID-19 safety protocols that were agreed to by the AMPTP. As you are probably already aware, last summer we put together the Safe Way Forward along with the other unions and guilds, the DGA, IATSE, and the Teamsters, which led to the return to work agreement with our employers. As with the original protocols that were negotiated last fall, the updated protocols that we are about to go through for today were negotiated by SAG-AFTRA in partnership with all the other unions, and that was absolutely crucial. These guidelines are based on the latest science and the data available, and they reflect SAG-AFTRA's commitment to getting our members back to work safely. We have a lot of ground to cover today, so I am going to turn it over to our SAG-AFTRA National Executive Director, Duncan Crabtree Ireland, in just a moment, and he's going to give us a detailed update on all the changes that you can expect to see on set. Before I do that, though, I want to thank Duncan and the SAG-AFTRA team for their extraordinary work, both on the original and now on these updated safety protocols. You know, I know that when I'm speaking for all the members, when I say that I sleep better at night knowing that we can rely on our union to keep us as safe as possible at work. As COVID is increasing on the rise due to the Delta and Lambda variants, I'm really grateful for the vigilance of our staff in responding to this ever-changing situation. And so after Duncan's presentation today, we're going to have a Q&A from our members. So if you have any questions, you can submit those to pteoe@sagaftra.org. That's pteoe@sagaftra.org. So without further ado, I'm going to give a big welcome to our National Executive Director, Duncan Crabtree Ireland. Duncan, hello, and welcome to the Return to Work Update.
Hello, thank you so much for those kind words, Rebecca, and hello, everybody. I think we all know that keeping members safe at work has always been a top priority for SAG-AFTRA. It's central to our mission, and it's a charge we take very seriously. The pandemic has been devastating on so many fronts, but working with our partners across the industry, and especially our sister unions, and watching how folks have banded together and shown ingenuity and determination to get back to work has been a really bright spot in a dark time. This is some of the most important work that we've ever done, and I just want to thank all of our members for their input and participation in this process. So now why don't we get down to business and get into the details of the revised and updated return to work agreement. Okay, so just to kick it off, again, we mentioned that the workplace safety remains the union's top priority. Actually, I think, Rebecca, you might have some words to say as we kick off the first slide, if I'm not mistaken, or did you want me to just take that?
Oh, I sure can. I think a big part of what SAG-AFTRA really focused on is that we were always going to change as the information and the science changed. And that was absolutely critical to our philosophy, not just our philosophy, but the philosophy of all the unions working together. And in this fluid situation, we have made changes as it requires changes or tweaks along the way. The protocols are really intended to keep the cast and crew healthy by setting up an environment that provides the lowest risk possible for safety and health. So these protocols are obviously built on the medical, scientific, and policy standards that were set forth by government experts like CDC and otherwise, coupled with input from highly trained experts recruited to structure a safe workplace given our industry's unique environment, like our own epidemiologist, industrial hygienist, and so forth. It's really important to acknowledge that there's no such thing as a no risk environment. But what we have seen now with a year of actual practical experience, that this does create a lower risk workplace. And so I'm going to turn it right back over to you, Duncan.
Thanks. And those are such crucial points, and especially the point that there is a really significant impact of the safety protocols on set safety. And that's now, after, as you said, a year's experience, been well documented by the results of the testing program that's been in place during this time. But we'll get into all of those details. I do think that one of the things we definitely need to point out is that the new safety protocols agreement lasts through September 30th of this year. So this is not a long-term agreement. The reason that that expiration date is September 30th is because I think all recognize that there's a lot of volatility in the situation with COVID. Obviously, all of us who were seeing very promising results earlier in the spring and early summer, now with new variants out in play, we've seen some setbacks. And so the unions and management all agreed that it was important for us to continue revisiting these safety protocols in short period of time, so as to make sure that any changes in the science, as well as any developments in the overall course of the pandemic, could be addressed in an updated set of protocols. So we're going to talk about a variety of different areas that have been changed in the protocols, but I do want to just emphasize that the overall structure of the protocols remains the same, and all of the key elements that we've seen provide so much success in providing safe sets over the last year remain in place. So we're going to talk about things such as vaccination and how that affects different parts of the protocols, including mandatory vaccination policies. We're going to talk about changes to the testing system, where they apply, and how the agreement is structured in order to make sure that we allow flexibility where we can, but also ensure that safety remains the #1 priority. So let's talk about the keys to safety. This is a graphic that some of you who saw our previous webinar on this topic from last September, after the original return to work agreement was put in place, may recall. So those keys include vaccination, they include testing, they include maintaining the zone system, which we can talk a little bit about, but I think most people who've worked on a set are very familiar with it, and that zone system will remain in place. They include the use of personal protective equipment, and they include COVID compliance supervision. And all of those pieces together, all of those elements of the safety program taken together, are what have ensured the kind of high level of safety that we've seen and protection from COVID that we've seen on our sets throughout the course of the pandemic. So there's a lot of detail about these areas in the return to work agreement. And by the way, that return to work agreement, the full text of it is available to everybody on the SAG-AFTRA website at sagaftra.org/back-to-work. So if you need some light bedtime reading, you can find that 100-page agreement there, but you can also find a summary of the changes to the agreement and FAQs for those who might not be in a position to read the entirety of the agreement. But we're going to go through those key points today and focus on those changes. So let's start by talking about testing. So the testing protocols have changed only slightly as a result of the revised return to work agreement. First of all, let's note that I'm sorry, having a little technical difficulty with the slide here. Sorry, just one second. I think I need to change this order. Okay, actually, so we'll talk more about the testing, details of the testing protocol in just a minute, but the testing protocols have changed a little bit. For most people, there will still be regular periodic testing, and I do want to emphasize that pre-employment testing, in other words, the testing that you do prior to starting a job, that remains unchanged under the agreement. We also, as I mentioned before, have the zone system, which will remain in place. We have PPE, some changes to the PPE requirements depending upon the nature of the risk level from the pandemic in the particular area in which your production is occurring. And as I mentioned before, the COVID compliance supervision team will remain in place throughout that process. And there will be no change to the requirement to have a COVID compliance supervisor on board on every production, because of course, the best safety protocols that we could put in place won't be of value unless they're enforced and followed. And the COVID compliance teams have been central to making that happen. And then, as I mentioned before, we will talk about vaccination. So first of all, I want to talk about how these protocols are structured. The new agreement has sort of a two paths that you can follow depending upon the circumstances in the particular location where your production is filming. And part one of the protocols applies in areas where there is a higher risk of COVID, and as a result has stricter protocols in place. There's also a part two, which is designed for use in places that have a lower risk of COVID based on the circumstances in that location and have some less strict protocols. So throughout the course of the presentation, we're going to discuss how the protocols work in a part one area or in a part two area. And so we'll talk a little bit about how you define whether an area is a part one area or a part two area later. But just as a shorthand for thinking about it, part one, that's higher risk areas where the protocols are stricter, and part two is lower risk areas where the protocols may be less strict. So let's start by talking about when part one protocols apply, the stricter protocols. First of all, part one protocols always apply to productions outside the United States and Canada. So any production occurring anywhere in the world outside the US or Canada is automatically under part one, the stricter protocols. So just start by saying that. In addition, within the United States and Canada, part one applies when the COVID risk is high based on the triggers that were put into the agreement. And those two key factors that are looked at to determine whether a location falls into this stricter, higher risk area is, first of all, whether the COVID transmission rate in that metro area is above 1.1 for a consecutive 7-day period. This is also known as the R-naught for those who have become armchair epidemiologists. This is the R-naught. The COVID transmission rate is above 1.1 for a consecutive 7-day period. And also the new case count is at or above 10 cases per 100,000 for that same 7 consecutive day period. So I know that sounds very technical, and it is a little bit technical, but this is really, these protocols have always been and remain science driven and driven by the advice of the expert epidemiologists and medical advisors that all the unions together are employing. And so the consensus of those advisors were these are the two key factors that are objective that we can look at to determine whether there is a higher level of risk in a particular area. And by the way, this data is readily available to anybody, to all members, and we encourage you to look up this data for the areas you might be working in so that you can feel knowledgeable and empowered. There's a website called covidactnow.org that you can find online, and we'll go through that, I think, again a little bit later, where you can track this exact information for every metro area and every county in the United States. And so that'll allow you to see for yourself whether a particular area falls within the part one triggers or not. Just as a reference point, as of now, the Los Angeles metro area, the New York metro area, and the Atlanta metro area are all currently under part one, the stricter protocols, due to the status of the COVID transmission and new case rate in each of those metro areas. So then we talk about part two. This less strict protocols, first of all, again, only apply within the US and Canada, and only applies when the triggers are not met and the COVID risk is therefore not as high. And it's the same triggers that you just saw, except that it's the inverse of them. So the COVID transmission rate has to be below 1.1 for 7 consecutive days in that metro area or county. And the number of daily cases has to be below 10 per 100,000 for that same period. So in essence, the way this works is if you're in a metro area that currently is below those triggers, once those triggers are met for a 7 consecutive day period, that area will shift into part one or stricter protocol status. And it will stay there until both of those triggers go below those thresholds again for a 7-day period, 7 consecutive day period. And then at that point, the less strict protocols could be resumed. I do also want to just note that producers and employers are always within their rights to employ the stricter protocols, even in an area that's under Part 2. That's an option that every employer has as part of their responsibility to maintain a safe workplace for all workers, including our members. So continuing on, there are some areas of difference depending upon whether you're in a Part 1 or a Part 2 area location. So the main differences that you'll see in the protocols between Part 1 and Part 2 are, first of all, in the area of testing requirements. And so that's one thing we're going to talk about. Second of all, with respect to the requirement to use PPE. And third, in terms of physical distancing requirements in certain cases. And you'll see down here at the bottom of this slide, there's a reference to that website that I mentioned, COVID Act Now. This is the website that you can go to see the current status of each of those triggers for every metro area or county in the United States. So it's a good web link for you to have and to make use of if you're going to be working and want to just check to see what the current status of any particular area within the United States is. And the companies and the unions have jointly agreed to use this website as our primary source for that information. So let's talk more detail about the testing requirements in the two different parts of the agreement. So first of all, under the stricter protocols, this is the Part 1 area. The periodic testing for Zone A is going to remain the same. So there will continue to be 3 times a week testing for everyone who's working in Zone A. There's just 2 changes to that. First of all, for people who are fully vaccinated, and one of the things you'll see throughout this presentation is there are a number of protocols that depend on the vaccination status of the particular person. But for people who are fully vaccinated, approved antigen tests can now be used in combination with 1 lab-based PCR test per week. So for those who aren't that familiar with this, PCR testing is sort of the highest possible level of testing. We've required PCR testing since the beginning of the safety protocols. For a good long while, we did not authorize antigen testing because at the time, our medical advisors indicated that the antigen tests were not yet reliable enough for that purpose. That has changed. The antigen test quality has developed, and taking into account vaccination status, the medical advisors for all of the unions have agreed that it would be okay to begin the use of antigen tests as the 2 additional tests per week on top of the lab-based PCR test. And this is helpful because, among other things, antigen test results come back very quickly. That is typically within about a 15 to 20 minute period. And so they are less costly and faster, and used in combination with a weekly PCR test. Our advisors are confident that this will provide an excellent level of protection. I do want to also note that we have now agreed to allow for pool testing. For those who aren't familiar with this is where multiple samples are combined together to conduct a COVID test. And the reason to do it is it reduces the number of tests required, it lowers costs, and it also can reduce the burden on the labs that are running those tests. The way that then works is, let's say you pool together several tests, you test them all together in one batch, and then if there's any positive result, then each individual sample has to be retested to determine where the positive result came from. But if there is no positive result, if it's all negative, then you know that all of the tests combined in that pool were negative. There is a limitation in the agreement to no more than 8 samples being combined for purposes of pool testing under the agreement. And so that's the testing requirements in Part 1. So other than that, everything remains the same about testing in the stricter protocols area, the Part 1 area. In the Part 2 areas, the locations where the less strict protocols apply, there are some changes to the testing requirements. First of all, for vaccinated employees in Zone A, they will only be required to test once per week with a PCR test. So that will go from a 3 times a week testing process to a 1 times a week testing process for Zone A vaccinated employees only. In Zone B, the current testing schedule, which is once a week, will become once every other week for Zone B fully vaccinated employees. In Zone C and D, there will be no periodic testing required for fully vaccinated employees. Do want to note that on Part 2 in the less strict areas for unvaccinated employees, the requirements remain the same as they currently are. So unvaccinated workers, including performers in Zone A, will continue to test 3 times a week using at least one lab-based PCR test along with other PCR and rapid PCR tests during the course of that week. Zone B will continue to test once per week. Zone C will test every other week, and Zone D has never had a periodic testing requirement. And so those are the requirements for unvaccinated employees. So just emphasizing that, especially in Part 2, there is a difference in the testing protocols depending on whether you're fully vaccinated or not. For air travel, want to just note that beginning with this agreement within the United States and Canada, so for domestic travel only, there is not a requirement for a pre-flight COVID test unless it is required by the airline or by the government. Of course, that doesn't stop somebody from getting a pre-flight COVID test if they want to do that, but that is no longer required. For any travel outside the US or Canada, a pre-flight COVID test is still required as it was before. And we have removed any post-flight testing requirement that's specifically connected to the flight. But once someone arrives at their work destination, they'll be part of the periodic testing that's already required under Parts 1 and Part 2, depending on the circumstances of where they're going. So in terms of payment for time spent screening, just want to emphasize this and make sure everybody understands there has been no change whatsoever to the stipends and payments that are required for COVID testing time. So when you are required to take a COVID test, if that COVID test does not happen during work time, so it's not when you're already on set or already working, you have to do a special trip to get tested or whatever. In those cases, you will continue to receive the stipends and payments that have been in place since last September under the Return to Work Agreement. Next, I want to talk about personal protective equipment. So I know this is a hot topic. A lot of people are very interested in this. In the Part 1 system, which is the stricter protocol system, it will continue to be the rule, as it has been, that unvaccinated employees must wear masks at all times, except when eating, drinking, or on camera. So that is not a change. That remains exactly the same. Additionally, in the Part 1 areas, all employees, regardless of vaccination status, must always wear masks indoors, again, except when drinking, eating, or filming. And in addition, there is a provision in the agreement which allows for a face shield and goggles to be provided for both performers, if applicable, or also other people who are working in close proximity to performers upon request. I want to note this is in addition to masks, not instead of masks. For Part 2, this is the areas with the less strict protocols. Unvaccinated employees, just like in Part 1, must wear masks at all times, except when eating, drinking, or filming. So indoors, outdoors, whatever, if you are not vaccinated, you must wear a mask at all times. Vaccinated employees are required to wear masks in a vehicle. So anytime anyone is being transported, everyone needs to wear masks, but fully vaccinated performers do not need to wear a mask indoors or outdoors in those Part 2 less strict protocols areas. Now, please note that's under the terms of the protocols. There may be local or even national health guidelines that may alter that. Obviously, we've seen some real developments in this area just over the past few weeks. And so that is a very, as an area where there's a lot of change. And so be mindful that that could shift depending upon governmental requirements or recommendations. And likewise, there is a right of performers to request face shields and goggles in addition to masks for those who might be working in close proximity for themselves or others. Next, it is allowable for producers to implement their own stricter PPE policies if they wish to do so, both in Part 1 and Part 2 areas. So in all cases, it is still true that performers and all other workers on set will need to comply with the producer's policies regarding implementing PPE requirements. So long as they're reasonable, they're allowed to do that. And if there's any questions or concerns about that, please contact SAG-AFTRA, and we'll be glad to help address any concerns you might have in that area. So now let's turn to the question of mandatory vaccination policies. I know this is an area that has been of great interest to people, and also people have a wide-ranging views on the topic. This agreement does allow for employers to implement mandatory vaccination policies on a production-by-production basis for performers and others working in Zone A. That includes a couple of specifically defined roles, as well as people who we all know are part of Zone A. That includes studio teachers specifically. Even studio teachers who might not be working on set are included in the mandatory vaccination policy provisions of this part for Zone A. The SAG-AFTRA National Board gave extensive consideration to the question of mandatory vaccination policies, as well as our President's Blue Ribbon Commission on Safety. And with those extensive discussions, implemented a number of parameters and requirements in order for employers to have this type of mandatory vaccination policy to ensure that it would be applied in a manner that's fair to all performers and all workers. So among those are the fact that disabilities and any kind of sincerely held religious belief must be subject to reasonable accommodations as required by law. And that's embedded, not only is that a legal requirement, that's embedded in the return to work agreement, along with the requirement for employers to provide proper notice and notification of the intention to implement a mandatory vaccination policy. It is, of course, the case that anyone who is too young to receive a vaccine under the use authorizations granted by the FDA is not required to be vaccinated in order to work. And it is also the case that for anyone who's working on a project now or during the implementation of the rollout of these mandatory vaccination policies, that the producer is required to provide sufficient time for those individuals to get vaccinated before implementing that requirement. And there are more details about how that actually works in the agreement, or we can answer questions on that topic as well. I know there's one of the questions that's come up is sort of what kind of exemptions apply? Like, what are the medical exemptions that we're talking about? The medical exemptions flow from the Americans with Disabilities Act. And so the kinds of things that we're talking about, and there are probably only a relatively small number of medical conditions that directly warrant an exemption or accommodation here, but there are certainly specific things such as people who might be on immune suppressant medication as a result of an organ transplant, people who suffer from certain specific illnesses, et cetera, that can definitively qualify for a medical exemption. But I think the key point is that these medical exemption discussions happen on a case-by-case basis, on an individual basis between the employer and the individual. And that's what's required under federal law. It's called the interactive process. And so there has to be an interactive process where the employer, where the producer talks with the individual, the performer, the worker, and they exchange information about what kinds of accommodations are needed so that the employer can determine how to implement those accommodations and whether they can do that or not. So that's what will happen when somebody has a exemption request. It's also important to note that there are specific rules in place in this agreement about when employers, producers can ask about vaccination status and what information they can ask for. So the first thing that I want to note is if there is no mandatory vaccination policy in place for the production, so if the production has not decided to mandate that, oh my gosh, if the production has not decided to mandate that, then the production cannot ask about vaccination status at all prior to making the hiring decision. That is so important because that's how we ensure that that producers, casting people, or anybody else is not getting vaccination information prior to making that hiring decision. Because if there's not a mandatory vaccination policy in place, then there should be no legitimate reason to ask about vaccination status prior to hiring. And that can also provide some confidence in the performer that there's not going to be a sort of subtle discrimination going on based on that information being solicited about their vaccination status before the hiring decision is made. Now, if there is a mandatory vaccination policy in place, then that's a little bit different. If there is a mandatory vaccination policy in place, the producer, either themselves or through, for example, a casting director, can ask a very specific question of people, which is, are you fully vaccinated, or do you have a sincerely held religious belief or disability that would prevent you from becoming fully vaccinated, or that would warrant an exemption? And that's really a yes or no question. So if you're asked that, it's not that they can then delve into that any further. It's simply saying, you either have to be vaccinated or have a legitimate exemption request to work on this production. Is that the case? And then you simply say yes. If you are vaccinated, or if you have an exemption request, you say yes. And then the hiring process continues. And only after you've been hired can they then ask more information about the exemption request or your vaccination status. If you are not vaccinated and you don't have a medical basis for that, or a sincerely held religious belief basis for that, then you would have to answer no to that question. And the employer can use that information to decide whether to hire you, because of course, if they have a mandatory vaccination policy, and if you are not vaccinated and don't have a legitimate exemption basis, then you're not going to be able to be hired on that production, because that's the nature of a mandatory vaccination policy. Continuing on, as far as verification of vaccination status, it is required under the agreement that producers verify vaccination status, and that can be done through one of several ways. They can be shown a digital vaccination card that has been authorized by a government agency or a verification service that checks against government records. So that would be, for example, in New York, there's something called the Excelsior Pass. In California, there is a California Department of Health Services has a vaccination verification system online. So that would be acceptable. You can also present either a digital or physical copy of a physical vaccination card, the CDC card that so many people are familiar with. And the producer does have to use one of those methods to verify vaccination status. It's not purely a honor system. And the producer has to maintain any documentation about vaccinations that they may get as part of that process in a secure manner, and provide access to the documentation only to those with a legitimate need to know. Having said that, it's also important that people on set, where you're relying on vaccination status as part of the safety protocols, that people on set be able to instantly and reliably understand whether someone is entitled to work under the vaccination protocols or not. And so it is required in the agreement that the producer establish some kind of system where it's clearly and visibly identified as to who is working under vaccination status. So for example, who has perhaps in a Part 2 area less frequent testing, or who's entitled to not be masked indoors, et cetera. That has to be clearly and visibly identified. The producer can establish a system of their choice that accomplishes that, but that does have to be done, and that's to be overseen by the COVID compliance supervisor. So let's move on and talk a little bit about temporary COVID sick leave. So you may already be familiar with this. This has been a feature of the return to work agreement since its inception back last September, but we now are expanding the temporary COVID sick leave to also apply to time that's spent getting vaccinated and recovering from the effects of any side effects of vaccination for anyone who's already been engaged on a production. So if you're engaged on a production and you need to go get a vaccination, or you do go get a vaccination and you have side effects and can't work, you are entitled to use the temporary COVID sick leave program for that time off. As far as quarantine pay goes, quarantine pay is largely the same as it has been since last September. However, there is a change, or it's not really a change, but a recognition that if someone is required to quarantine solely because of their unvaccinated status, that the producer is not required to pay for additional quarantine time that results from someone being unvaccinated. So if there's a quarantine that applies equally to everyone, regardless of vaccination status, then the quarantine pay works the same way. If there's a quarantine that applies to somebody solely because of their unvaccinated status, then the producer is not obligated to pay for that unless there is a specific medical or sincerely held religious belief exemption already in place. Now we can talk a little bit about meals. The rules for meals will be the same in Part 1 and Part 2 locations, but there is still going to be a prohibition on buffet-style meal service, but it will apply only to unvaccinated workers on set. So if you are unvaccinated, you will still have to be served meals in an individual packaged manner, and you will still have to physically distance during meal times in any kind of area where you're eating your meal or on a rest period. If you are fully vaccinated, the producer will be able to provide self-service meal options. So that could be in a buffet form or in some other form of self-service meal options. And the physical distancing requirements for meal times are no longer in place if you are fully vaccinated. And so that's another example where the visual indication of vaccination eligibility will have to be in place, because a producer will need to make sure that people are following those protocols, depending on whether they are able to participate in that or not. For transportation, we have two sort of levels here. Again, Part 1 and the stricter protocols. In Part 1 areas, separate vehicles will be required for vaccinated and unvaccinated passengers. But regardless of vaccination status, you are required to wear masks when in a transport vehicle, unless for some reason you can't. For example, if you're already in makeup and you're being transported from one place to another, that would be an exception. But generally, everyone will have to wear masks when they're transported, regardless of vaccination status. Under Part 2, the less strict protocols, again, everyone has to wear masks, and the capacity limitations for transportation are removed. So they can, in a less strict protocol area, producer can use vans at their full capacity, for example, for transportation. Everyone does have to wear masks. And if anyone can't be masked, so for example, again, if a performer is in makeup, then the physical distancing requirements do apply, which means the capacity limitations on vans, for example, would be in place as they are now. So if everyone can be fully masked in a less strict protocols area, the full van capacity can be used. In a less strict protocols area, if anyone's unmasked, then the current capacity limitations are still in place. Makeup and hair protocols. So due to the close proximity of performers and makeup and hair professionals, PPE and hygiene requirements will remain in place. And that means that under Part 1, for example, a makeup artist must continue to wear appropriate PPE while in close proximity to a performer that can't physically distance, even if both the makeup artist and the performer are fully vaccinated. Nonetheless, in a stricter protocols area, that still has to be the case, and that's not optional. And of course, as I mentioned before, there's the ability to request additional PPE beyond masking. In a less strict protocols area, again, the default is that makeup and hair personnel must wear masks when in close proximity to a performer, regardless of their vaccinated status. However, if both the makeup and hair artist are vaccinated and the performer is vaccinated, if the performer consents, then they can choose to depart from that mask requirement if it's allowable under the local health regulations or federal guidelines. I do want to note that's not a scenario where performers need to be asking makeup or hair people to put masks back on. This is something where someone would have to ask the performer if it's okay with them before anyone is unmasked. Next, let's talk about casting and auditions. First of all, I want to note that the language that was in the return to work agreement that referenced self-tape auditions has been completely removed from the revised return to work protocols. And that's because, first of all, there's anticipation that there will be some return to in-person casting even during the rest of the pandemic. But also, we're encouraging greater use of interactive virtual auditions as opposed to self-tapes. That's not to say that self-tapes are prohibited. It is to say that we don't want to emphasize self-tapes in the same way that they were emphasized in the early days of the pandemic. Physical distancing requirements will still apply for in-person casting for unvaccinated people. So if there's any unvaccinated people participating in a casting session, there will need to be the full physical distancing in place. Live audiences will now be allowed if the audience members are vaccinated and undergo a screening for symptoms upon entry. There still has to be an appropriate physical separation between live audiences and performers who might be working without PPE. So that's a new development. I do want to emphasize that the safety protocols that we've been talking about and that are in place are not optional. As I mentioned, this is all science-based and driven by the advice of our science and medical advisors, and it's here for the protection of everybody's health and safety. And so every element of the protocols are mandatory and cannot simply be neglected or ignored. Other than, for example, legitimate ADA-based modifications to protocols as part of that interactive process that I mentioned earlier, there are no exceptions to the safety protocols. They are in place and can only be deviated from based on those authorized reasons or by agreement between the unions and the producers. And I do want to note, because this has been rare, but it has happened over the past months, that there have been some individuals who simply refuse to comply with safety protocols. And the employers, the producers, are entitled to discharge those individuals without any kind of additional obligation to them. So if you have some concern or issue with safety protocols or their implementation, we urge you to contact SAG-AFTRA so we can discuss that with you, because non-compliance with them really isn't an option. And I do want to note that also we have a rule, a SAG-AFTRA disciplinary rule, that also requires our members to comply with SAG-AFTRA approved safety protocols. And so that is true from the union side as well as from the employer side. So again, I think it's really important to note that contacting SAG-AFTRA is one of your best ways to address any concerns that you might have about the safety protocols, how they're implemented, how they apply to you, or to a set that you're working on. Of course, you can also always approach the on-set COVID compliance supervisor, and you should feel free to do that. That's what they're there for. Their job is to help make sure that COVID safety protocols are completely followed. And of course, since they're right there on the set in the moment, they may be able to take action right away to help address your concerns. But if you're uncomfortable approaching them for whatever reason, if you have approached them and don't feel like you're being taken seriously, if you have whatever concern, we're here for you. That's why we're here. You can contact SAG-AFTRA either by phone at our at 855 SAG-AFTRA. You can contact our member care contact center through email as well at info@sagaftra.org. And of course, we have a 24-hour on-set safety hotline at 844-SAFER-SET. And all of these numbers are on your member card, as well as the member app that hopefully you all have. And so, oh, and I should have clicked this so that those would show up on the screen. So I'll do that now. All of these ways that you can contact SAG-AFTRA, we really want you to know that we're here to address the concerns that you have and to make sure that you feel safe on set. It's been a real privilege to hear from many members over the past months that for many people, working on set has felt like the safest place they've been other than in their own home during the course of the pandemic. And it's very gratifying to hear that. And it's something we definitely want to make sure that our members continue to feel when they're on set. And so if you have any doubts or concerns, I hope you will reach out to us so that we can address them and respond to those concerns and help in any way we can. So I think that takes us to a Q&A part of this presentation. And I think I'm turning it back over to our Executive Vice President, Rebecca Damon.
Hi there. Thank you, Duncan. Gosh, that was so much information. But I think that's really what people need. They really need to have all this information. And, you know, we all learn differently. So it's also, even though it's all available on the website, like hearing you explain it, I think is helpful for a lot of members. So thank you for that. I'm going to jump right into the Q&A because we have a lot of questions and I want to, in the time we have, get to as many as I can. The first one, clarification on what happens when the agreement expires. Will you just extend? Do you renegotiate? How does that work?
No, it's a great question. It kind of depends on the circumstances at the time. There will be some amount of renegotiation, I'm sure, because just, you know, the circumstances of the pandemic have been changing so rapidly. When the agreement originally expired on April 30th, We ended up extending the agreement for about 2 months because we really needed an opportunity to get some additional information about vaccine impact and things like that. But we did make a change at that time to refresh the COVID sick leave that was paid. So I would expect as we approach September 30th, the unions and the AMPTP will be looking closely at what the situation is with the pandemic around the country. We're closely watching the impact of variants. Obviously, the Delta variant is of great concern to all of us. And then we'll make a determination at that point what modifications might need to be made. I do just want to emphasize in designing this part 1, part 2, stricter and less strict protocols, we were specifically contemplating the coming predominance of the Delta variant. It was something that our epidemiologists and our medical experts saw coming. And that is one of the reasons why we have this 2-tiered approach to safety, because even though some people wanted to just move to a more relaxed environment, just as a general rule, our medical advisors felt strongly that we needed to keep the strictest protocols in place in the event that the Delta variant took off like it now has. And so I think members should feel very confident in knowing that the spikes that we're seeing as a result of the Delta variant were something that were taken into account in developing this set of protocols. And we feel confident that our members can feel safe working on sets under the part 1 stricter protocols, even in places where there is that surge that we're seeing from the Delta variant.
You know, Duncan, I'm glad you raised that, because I think, you know, a lot of times people, you made a joke about armchair epidemiologists. It really is having the medical professionals, the scientific professionals, both of SAG-AFTRA that we have in the mix, but also the DGA, IATSE, the Teamsters, all of that sort of collaboration, so that we are always right on the forefront of the science. I'm grateful for all the work that you and the staff have done to keep us up to speed on that, though, as members. So here's a question. Are you creating new or different protocols or rules for commercials?
We have protocols in place with the JPC for commercials now, and we certainly will continue to review those along the same lines as we've been doing in film and television and streaming, in order to make sure that those protocols reflect the most current science and address questions of vaccination, et cetera. Obviously, commercials tend to be shorter duration productions, so there may be some variation in how the protocols play out because of the unique nature of commercial work, but the fundamentals are precisely the same. And we do have those protocols in place, and we'll continue updating them as needed as well.
Great, thank you. So this question, how do I know what set of protocols, part 1 versus part 2, applies to the production that I'm in?
Sure, there's several ways. First of all, obviously the producer and the COVID compliance supervisor in particular is responsible for watching out for that. The union is also monitoring that, and where we see changes that affect large production centers, we will certainly share that information. But I think it's really great as a member that you can also be very empowered to look at this directly yourself. So again, if you go to that covidactnow.org website, you can, if you know where you're going to be shooting, where the production location is going to be, you can simply go to that area on covidactnow.org, and you can see what the current status is, and you can also see what the status has been over the preceding months, weeks, and days. So what you can do is just simply go there, look up the location that you're going to be shooting in, and then look at the stats for the last 7 days and see if either of those triggers have been exceeded for 7 consecutive days. Either there's been an R0, an infection rate higher than 1.1 or higher, or if there have been 10 or more cases per 100,000 reported in that area for the past 7 consecutive days. If both of those things are true for the past 7 consecutive days, then you'll be working in a part 1 area. If neither of those things are true, if the infection rate and the new case count are below those thresholds for the past 7 days, then you'll be working in a part 2 area, provided you're in the US and Canada. And again, a reminder, if you're working outside the US and Canada, it's always a part 1 location. So that one's pretty straightforward.
Yeah, it's an easy to navigate website. I know that right in the beginning when you were looking at it, a lot of our experts, it was one of my favorites. It was actually raised to me by a member saying, hey, this is a member with a family with medical background, saying this is so easy, because there's a lot of websites that give the same information, but it's just complex to see and it's very understandable, which I like.
Yeah, and then I think it's also good to know that because the companies and the unions have all agreed to use that as the primary source, you won't get into one of these situations where there is, some kind of, delay. Like if there's a delay in reporting on some other site and now the information doesn't seem to match up, we have a single authoritative source. And that source has proved to be reliable over the course of the pandemic, which is, I think, why the medical doctors and epidemiologists and industrial hygienists have all felt very comfortable with using that as the primary source.
Great, go science. All right, so here's a question. Am I allowed to ask castmates or crew about their vaccination status so that I can keep my distance? And is that legal?
Well, I mean, there's not a prohibition on you asking, although, obviously, one of the things that's in the agreement, as I mentioned, is that the producer will be establishing a visible system for determining whether someone's entitled to work under the vaccinated protocols or not. And so you may not really need to ask, because you may be able to simply determine that from just that visible identifier, whether that's a wristband or whether that's a lanyard or whatever the system is that they might put in place. I do want to note that people who have a medical exemption, for example, someone who requires an ADA accommodation for a medical condition, they're really not required to discuss that or share that personal information with anyone other than as part of that interactive process with the producer. So I think if you were considering doing something along these lines, I would tread carefully because that might be perceived as a bit invasive to ask people that. And that's one of the reasons why we wanted, I think, collectively to make sure that people could simply visually see, are people following the protocols? If I'm here in a buffet line and going to be sitting at a table near somebody, are they supposed to be there or not? And so relying on that visual identifier is really the method that was contemplated for how you deal with that.
And thank you for laying out the piece about the ADA piece, because I think there is a sensitivity that people don't necessarily always put that into consideration. So I'm very glad you did. What is the union doing to protect actors that cannot receive the vaccine due to sincerely held religious beliefs or medical issues? And, how do you make sure, how can they, how can anybody ensure that these exemptions are being honored?
Well, the first way that we're addressing it is by putting specific language in the return to work agreement about it. So the return to work agreement explicitly requires that employers adhere to the interactive process and allow people to make these exemption requests and that they consider them appropriately. But perhaps even more importantly, B, as I mentioned earlier, there's a limitation on what the employers can ask about prior to making the hiring decision. And that's specifically there to help deter any type of subtle discrimination based on people's vaccination status or based on whether they're seeking an exemption request under the ADA or for religious reasons. Because really the producer cannot ask about that until they've already told you you're hired. So once they've said to you, okay, you got the gig, now we need to know about your vaccination status or exemption request. At that point, if there is an issue, you'll know that that's what it's from. And if you detect that they are not taking your exemption request seriously, if you feel like it's being handled inappropriately, contact SAG-AFTRA. We have a procedure and protocols in place for how we can provide support to our members who might feel like that is not being they're not being fairly considered in their requests for exemptions. And there's action that SAG-AFTRA can take, both informally and formally through our grievance and arbitration process. And we can also bring additional resources to members, including access to government agencies like the EEOC, for example, because it is not only a violation of our contract, but it is a violation of federal law for an employer not to engage in the interactive process in good faith with respect to these requests for exemptions.
Great. What are the cycle thresholds for the PCR and antigen tests? Would we be able to know that, or the test brand that we would take before doing it? How does that work?
So typically, I mean, you can ask production, and in some cases they may know or be able to provide you this information in advance. Cycle thresholds are really not a thing for antigen tests because the difference, one of the differences between a PCR test and an antigen test is with PCR tests, they use a method of what they call amplification, which basically is designed to ensure that if there's a tiny little bit of a virus present in the sample, that there's a cycle of heating and other chemicals that are added to basically cause that virus to replicate or expand so that they can detect it more easily using the PCR technique. The antigen tests don't use amplification in the same way, and so there's really not a cycle count for the antigen tests. But the antigen tests in question, there's 3 of them that have been specifically approved by the unions, the joint unions medical advisors, and those specific antigen tests, we're confident, have a sufficient level of accuracy and specificity to ensure that they're useful. Other antigen tests that are not specifically approved by the unions cannot be used by the employers for that purpose. As far as the PCR cycle thresholds, it actually varies by lab. There's not just one cycle threshold. So you can ask. My guess is that in most cases, maybe the COVID compliance supervisor will know that, but probably other people in production won't know the cycle threshold, and it's a request they'll have to make from the lab. But all of the labs that process these PCR tests are authorized and approved to do so, and they operate their testing under those emergency use authorizations. So really, the question of cycle thresholds it's an interesting topic that's come up with our epidemiologists in terms of sort of making predictions about where things are going. But for purposes of testing on set, it's not something that we expect producers to provide as a routine matter to our members.
Great. Thank you, Duncan. A lot of people probably never heard of any of that before today, but you did a great explanation, keeping it easy to understand. We have a question in terms of what is the agent doing to inform agents, managers, casting directors, other productions, not only about this, but also about medical and religious exemptions.
Sure. So we're actually this is our very first webinar on the new agreement, because of course we wanted to get this information out to our members first of all. But we are having webinars later this week that are specific for producers, that are specific for agents, managers, and lawyers, and we'll make sure that casting directors are also included in those webinars so that they will have the same information. Also, we have had posted since the day after this agreement was reached not only the full text of the agreement, but also a summary of the agreement and FAQs on our website at sagaftra.org/back-to-work. And so that's a resource that we've been directing people to. But I do just want to assure all of our members that we are in direct and regular contact with the key organizations that represent producers, casting directors, and of course the representatives who represent you as members. And so we want to make sure everybody has that information and understands how all of these pieces work together. And I think the questioner is right to particularly emphasize those limitations on inquiries about vaccination status and exemptions prior to hiring, because that is a key piece of making sure that people aren't treated unfairly or discriminated against as part of the hiring process.
Great, thank you. We're close to time, so I'm just going to try to squeeze a couple more in. If an agent or talent manager, casting director asks me about the status or asks me to share my medical records with them, should I do that? Is that legal? How does that work? People want to understand these particulars. If you can help with that one, Duncan.
Sure. So let me first of all just distinguish between medical records and a vaccination card. So if somebody is asking to share quote unquote medical records with them, that definitely should only be done after hiring. You should look with skepticism on requests to share medical records. There may be times when that's appropriate. For example, if for insurance purposes, a lead cast member has to do a certain kind of medical exam and that's been negotiated as part of their contract. That does happen from time to time. But for most performers, you should not be in a situation where you need to share medical records. It could come up as part of an interactive process discussion based on an exemption request. But even then, the types of medical records you would need to share are very limited. It's not like you need to get your doctor to open up your medical file to the employer or to your agent or to anyone else. So I would look with skepticism on that. If your agent is asking you, can I share your vaccination status if we're asked or whatever, that's a legitimate discussion for you and your agent to have. I do want to emphasize that we don't recommend that. We've put in place these limitations on when the producer can ask you questions in order to make sure that members are not discriminated against. And so our recommendation is that information is provided solely in response to producer questions that happen at the appropriate time. Having said that, people are free to share their own vaccination status if they wish to. That's their personal right to do that, and so that I'm sure will occur as well. I do want to note, and I think it's very interesting. We did do a survey of the membership about vaccination status, and that survey indicated that more than 80% of members were either already vaccinated or intended to be vaccinated. So it does seem like a large majority of SAG-AFTRA members are moving in that direction.
Great. Thank you, Duncan.
Rebecca, can I also add? I got a note here from our fantastic Chief Contracts Officer Ray Rodriguez pointing out that perhaps we should state the specific antigen tests that are authorized. So just for everyone's knowledge, these are the 3 authorized antigen tests, and this is in the agreement. You can find this in the document as well. Sienna Clarity is one. CareStart is the second one by Access Bio. And finally, Binax Now by Abbott Diagnostics. Those are the 3 that are authorized. And by the way, if you happen to be working in Canada, there's one called PanBio AG, which is exactly the same thing as Binax Now. It's just marketed under a different name in Canada. So it's still 3 tests, but that Binax Now is also sometimes known in Canada as PanBio AG.
Great. Thank you, Ray. Thank you, Duncan. Okay, so this question isn't specifically about the return to work, but it does feel relevant. So this member wants to know, more than just being on set, a lot of, classes that are starting to come back into the mix. And they want to know if these protocols should apply to like acting classes and other settings where groups of working actors find themselves doing scene study, various times rooms, several times a month. What do you look for? What should people be thinking about?
No, that's a great question. I mean, these protocols per se, I don't think can apply in those settings because there's not really an employer there. And the reality of the protocols is implementing the testing requirements, for example, it's not inexpensive. The AMPTP companies have spent tens of millions of dollars on testing over the since last September. And rightly so. But I think if you're in an acting class, it's unrealistic to think that the acting class people are going to be able to implement that same type of set of protocols. Having said that, a lot of what's in here can be adapted and can be really useful. I think probably the number one thing is, following the guidance of the CDC and others about remaining masked indoors, especially in areas where there is a high risk of COVID. So especially in those part 1 places, that would be a key element. Maintaining physical distancing wherever possible. Obviously doing things outdoors when you can, because it's pretty well established that that increases safety due to the ventilation. Making sure that you're working in well-ventilated environments. So all of those elements of the safety protocols, I think, are transferable to those settings. But I think people also need to just be very empowered to protect their own health and to know if you feel like an acting class, let's say, is being held under unsafe conditions, then you should empower yourself to not participate and find a different one that works better for you, or to communicate your concerns to the people running the class and see if they can make some changes to provide a safer environment.
Yeah, and obviously so many things are still also happening, Zoom, webinar, other formats, that it's great. Some people are still gonna stay in that format for some time to come. So that's always an option as well. We are very close to time, Duncan. I'm gonna ask you one more question of these great questions. And This one is, what if the shooting location is in a county that's part 2, but the cast and crew drive in daily from like a metro area that is part 1? I feel like that question has come up in other settings. So why don't you go ahead with that?
Sure. And actually, it brings up a point that I think is really important for people who are looking at COVID Act Now to evaluate their own potential, part 1, part 2 shooting status. We start with metro areas. So if there is a metro area in the place where you're going to be working. So for example, if you're working in the Los Angeles area, but you're actually shooting in Orange County, you don't look at Orange County, you look at the LA metro area. And you can determine this on COVID Act Now because it'll show you the metro area and what counties it includes. Likewise, the New York metro area includes parts of the tri-state region there. And so, so the metro area is all grouped together and all treated the same based on that. Now, it is true that if you're shooting or you're working somewhere outside of a metro area, then it defaults back to county. And so it is possible that someone could be, in a hotel in one county and then working in the next door county, and the status might be different. Ultimately, the status is driven by the shooting location, not the location of a hotel or other facilities that might be used. So if push comes to shove, we go with shooting location, but we think that's going to be a rare conflict because of the fact that metro areas will sweep in all the counties or many of the counties in that geographic area.
Yeah. Everybody's been looking at their metro areas since this came out. There you go.
Getting to know them so much better.
Right. There you go. That was great, Duncan. This is so helpful because there are so many things that we really can learn, and putting this into practice and people staying safe together. I'm about to wrap up unless there's anything that you want to add into the mix.
I think really just to say that there's been a tremendous amount of work done on this by the unions together. And I think we should particularly acknowledge the Directors Guild, IATSE, the Teamsters, and Basic Crafts, which encompasses a number of unions, because having been able to work together, we've been able to establish a single, it's a lengthy document, but at least it's one document with a single set of protocols that's consistently applied across the industry. And I think that's made everyone so much safer. And I also just want to generally acknowledge the hard work of the many members who've participated, both on the Safety Commission, the National Board, et cetera, in getting us to where we are. And I also want to really acknowledge the hard work of our staff who have just pulled all-nighters and worked so hard to make sure that we got these protocols put in place and that we're getting them communicated out. Particularly my colleague Ray Rodriguez, who, as I mentioned earlier, has been a central part of this process, but so many other members of our staff who have worked really hard on that. So I just want to thank all of those people and acknowledge their hard work in getting us to where we are and helping keep our members safe. And I think probably if I could just as a last note, I want to just mention that unfortunately our longtime National Director of Stun and Safety, Cedric Jackson, passed away last month. And I just want to particularly acknowledge him. He contributed a lot to the safety of members in general, but especially during the pandemic. He was on our first responder team, and it's been a heavy blow to lose Cedric, but I just want to acknowledge everything that he did to help get us here in these safety protocols. Thanks.
Oh, thank you, Duncan. Thank you so much for acknowledging that. I know Cedric meant a lot to the entire SAG-AFTRA family community for his work on this, for his longtime work with the stunt singers, dancers, other communities. It's really a real loss for all of us. And my gratitude also to the great staff team and all the members who really helped feedback, and just the constant commentary that we've had from people in terms of what's working, what's not working, all that stuff. And the fact that people do feel safer than in the general community as a result of these is a real credit to you and your team. I really want to thank everybody who joined us today, because we did cover a lot in a short amount of time. And I want to make sure that you know that you can always go to the website for more information. This will be on the YouTube channel, so you can come back and watch it again. If you need to take notes, refer it to others. We'll keep providing this kind of important member information. So if you want to check anything out on the website, that's sagaftra.org/return to work. sagaftra.org/return to work. So thanks to everybody who has been tuning in each week for the President's Task Force on Education, Outreach, and Engagement, or PTEOE, these live streams. And if you haven't already, since you're already on the YouTube page, please subscribe to SAG-AFTRA's YouTube channel so that you can get the updates on all the great content that we're posting. And I hope everybody stays safe, has a really good day. And if you're eligible to do so, get your vaccination. Thank you.